Hello there, my name's Annette with Sunbeam FPP and Sunbeam Fabric Art. Today I'm remaking my raven block. I got a request for another one, so I want to get that made, and I'm taking you through this pattern that I created in October of 23, and it is available on my Etsy shop. I'll leave a link in the description. This pattern is intermediate. A couple of the sections have small pieces, but for the most part, they're pretty easy to read, easy to put together. But let's get started. I've picked out a plain blue for the background fabric and this black starry fabric for the raven itself. You can see how wrinkly this blue fabric is. I'm not worried about that because when I'm foundation paper piecing, I am pressing after every single addition. So I'm not too worried about having this fabric pressed right now. This being a two-color pattern also helps to make it a little bit easier. There's only two colors you have to worry about, and they're easy to tell apart on the pattern. Now, I do have a piece that overlaps two pages. What I like to do in that case is cut a zigzag or curvy line that shows that join line, and then I tape those two pieces together, matching up the join line. My blue fabric does not have a right or wrong side, so it doesn't really matter which way I cut it, as long as I'm cutting it with enough seam allowance to cover the piece in the individual section. But you'll notice when I'm cutting out the pieces for the black pieces, I'm making sure my fabric is right side down when I am cutting out my fabric to cover up the piece on that section. This piece of blue I just cut out has an angle attachment, so I want to make sure and cut to match that angle. That's going to make it easier for me to stitch on later on. I'm making sure I have enough seam allowance on all sides. When I finish cutting the pieces for this section, I stack them up in number order. So then I will put the pattern piece on top of that stack or underneath the stack, whichever way I'm feeling that day, but they are in order of the sew order. So they are ready to go now. I'm going to speed through cutting out all the rest of the fabric. You're welcome to slow down the playback speed if you like. Let's talk about my setup for foundation paper piecing. I get my small pressing mat over here to the left of my sewing machine on the table, and my iron is plugged in, ready to go. I've got my stack of sections for this block with the pieces, and I'm just going to start with the first one, and we'll stitch this one through slowly so you can see how I process this. I'm making sure that piece 1 is covering all the seam allowance areas, and this piece 2 does have an angle, but I've cut it large enough to take that into account. It's not going to worry me at all because it's such a small piece. I just cut out a bigger square, and that's going to work for me here to add this piece 2. I can't see that stitch line through the paper and 2 dark fabrics, so I do fold back the paper to make sure both of these fabrics are overlapping that stitch line, so I do have my seam allowance. I've got my stitch length set to about 1.3 for paper piecing here. I always snip my threads after every addition, otherwise those threads can pop out where you least expect them. Now I'm going to fold back on my stitch line and just cut away the excess from the seam allowance. Now I'll move this over to the iron and press that seam open. Now remember, some of these pieces do have a right and a wrong side. I need to make sure when I'm adding piece 3 to the back and getting it sized up, I've got to have it right sides together with the fabric I've already stitched. So our pattern is face up, but on the back of the pattern, our fabric is going to be face down. Once I stitch the seam, again, I fold on the seam line, trim away the excess bulk from the seam, then I press that piece open. The fourth piece I'm adding here, I did cut a little angle, and I put that right side on the back where that angle is overlapping my stitch line, and when I fold this open, it should cover the piece I'm wanting to cover. This next piece also has a little angle, but I just cut a rectangle big enough that it's going to work for me. And when you're stitching on a foundation paper piece pattern, you need to stitch 1 or 2 stitches or even 2 and 3 stitches before your seam line, and then 1 or 2 or 3 stitches after your seam line to make sure everything stays together. I'll get the rest of these sections together and then we can talk about trimming them. On larger sections, I find that the fabric kind of flops around a little bit, so I always like to lay those down on my cutting mat and use my ruler to trim right along that dotted line, which is the cutting line. You can also put a 1/4 inch mark on the stitch line, and that should get you your dotted line. If you have trouble seeing that dotted line to trim, you can just put your ruler 1/4 inch mark on the stitching line, which is solid. When you're trimming, you'll note that some of the pattern pieces have little notches on the corners. You do need to trim those away on the dotted line. For my smaller sections that don't feel floppy, I will just pick up the piece and my scissors and cut on the dotted line. I also like to go through the cutoffs and pick out any pieces that are 1 inch or larger. This raven pattern is small enough that I can just lay it out as the picture shows on my tabletop. Sometimes I will flip the picture upside down so I can see the letters on the sections, but I think this one is going to be pretty easy just to leave it right side up, and I can follow the directions, the instruction sheet on which section to start with. I'm probably going to start with those top two sections, the face and the head of the raven. I look for the seams that need to match on this head and beak part, bill part, put a little circle there, and I added some other circles on places where sections are going to need to be matched up. I want to pay careful attention to those using my clips or pins or what have you to make sure my seams are going to match up here to get the best possible picture. There are two sections that go together to create the bill or beak and the neck section of the bird. So I'm going to join those on this long side here. There's nothing that needs to match, no seams that need to match, but I want to get a nice straight line on the shorter ends of what will be this rectangle. I'm going to go ahead and get rid of that paper because that way I can see better matching up this fabric to the fabric beneath. I'm trying to make sure that the short sides of the rectangle will be straight. If there's still paper under my needle, I leave that stitch length at 1.3. Sometimes I will change it. In this case, I'm not sure if I remembered or not. If I get to the end of the paper and there's nothing but fabric left, I'll change the stitch length to 2.4. Now I'm adding that third rectangle that is going to be the front, and again there's nothing I need to match up here. I really want to make sure though that that's a straight line that I'll be joining to that other bigger section. I'm going to go ahead and zip through putting the rest of this raven together. I've got several FPP videos. I've got a whole playlist on my other channel, Sunbeam Fabric Art, but for now I've moved FPP to this separate channel. I'll post a link to that particular playlist in the details section of this video if you want to go back and look at some of the other FPP patterns I've demonstrated, but you can also follow the link to my Etsy shop and purchase any of my patterns. Right now I'm working on a series of classic cars, but back in 2023 I did a bunch of birds. In 2024 I did a dozen different teapots based on antique teapots. Loved those. I've also done animals and lighthouses and sailboats, to name a few. Here's a look at our finished raven block side by side with the pattern. This block will finish to 12 inches square, so it's about 12.5 inches square right now. I hope you enjoyed this look at foundation paper piecing. Thanks for joining me, and I hope to see you back again real soon.